This research seminar series, so it's not just a one-stop event, it's a series of monthly events, is one of our responses in RISIS to COVID. So you know, most of our beloved conferences have been cancelled, some have been moved online, and we felt within RISIS we have a need to find a space of interaction. And you know, RISIS, and Emanuela Reale will shortly tell you more, is a research infrastructure, is not a research project, but a research infrastructure should provide something useful to scholars, and we had the idea we need to link more to scholars by offering this series of seminars based on data and work within RISIS, but opening to other people and to academic communities. And each seminar will have a presenter. Today is Barbara Antonioli Mantegazzini from Università della Svizzera Italiana, talking on business models in higher education. And we will have a discussant, and I really thank Hugo Horta from University of Hong Kong to be here. Hugo is a very distinguished scholar in higher education. We had a long discussion of a time, so it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Now, before giving the word to Emanuela, just to remind a few rules of the game. First, mute your microphone when you are not talking, because otherwise with 25 people around, it will be impossible to have a good sound. Second, you know, this will be recorded, and I think it will be put also on the RISIS website to be followed offline. And then for questions, please, we do this way. You should post your questions on the chat of the tool, and then I will moderate, because it's a bit difficult with so many people just to leave open the floor. And the intention is to have questions answered at the end, but you can post questions whenever they pop up during the presentation or the discussion. I might open some questions during the presentation. And I would also especially thank our staff, so Serena and Alessia, for helping us moving into this new virtual academic world. So I'm giving the word to Emanuela for a few words about RISIS.
Thank you, Benedetta, and thank you for the introduction of what research seminars are. I asked my colleague Serena to help me showing the few slides I have for presenting what RISIS is for those that are not yet involved in our community, and I hope that they could do it, could be so very, very soon. So we can move to the second slide, Serena, please. RISIS, what is? RISIS is an European research infrastructure. It means simply that it is supposed to provide all the type of access to resources one can imagine. It is what is interesting is that it is focusing on services and data on a specific topic and a specific area, a specific field, which is science and innovation studies. It is initiated in 2014 and supposed to move toward a long-term sustainable object, because the work that was done for the time being comes from very long path and is supposed to remain and stay for a long term. So it provides a free online accessible service, project-based data sets, tools for methodological advances, registers, visualization, and training, which is open to all the people, all attending people, as is free of charge. Could we please move to the, yes. Yes. This is a slide just to put in evidence what is the vision that RISIS want to promote for our field. That is, first, the visibility to gain visibility toward academics, stakeholders, and policymakers. Second, to have accessibility through distant access and increase the visualization tool which can be used by everybody. And having exploration of new indicators and critical reports. Next slide, please. It is important when we speak about a new software to understand the identity. RISIS take a clear position in the long term about what the research can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I have some
problem with somebody was not muted. It's now.
Okay, that's why I understand. So what I was saying is that identity of RISIS is very strong because it takes a very clear position on what a research infrastructure should be, and it decided to have a strong research orientation, which is exploited through providing facilities, resources, and services, but also by developing new data sets and indicators on science and technology and innovation policies. And this means that there is some research inside the group, some research that produce outputs that then can be shared with all the community, both the scientific, the scholars community, and the stakeholders community. Second, RISIS is clearly inscribed in the open science movement, and access and the understanding and interpretation of what open science means is complex, and it provides free access for all publishable research aims. And it is also embedded in open air environment, and it uses Zenodo as a repository for all outputs and outcomes. That means that everything is publicly available as soon as it is produced, whatever it is. And third, it is very important to foster impact and interaction with the research community, with an important investment in training, dissemination, and communication. And the last is the RISIS research seminar as a new way for impact and interaction and building a research community. Next slides. The structure is composed by dataset, by services, and services infrastructure, which is supposed to develop a new generation of indicators. Plus, there are other 4 new datasets under construction, and this will enrich the capability to address several research policy questions. Sorry, next slide. We have these data sets that can be grouped into, to understand what is their contents, can be grouped in more or less several families. There are something about knowledge dynamics, something about firm innovation, PhD and careers, policy learning, and European integration. Plus, there are 2 registers on firms and research organizations. All these resources are publicly available. The datasets families on firm innovation, knowledge dynamics, PhD, and European integration, as well as policy learning, are open for scholars that want to produce publishable research. The 2 registers are completely open to everybody. Next slide, please. I want to put your attention on this important tool, which is the NOMAC tool. Why it is important? Because it provides access, a combination access to a combination of data coming from several data sets in RISIS, producing the possibility, enabling the user to have to know things about actors in place as knowledge producers, about geography of knowledge producers around Europe, and about publications and patents of knowledge producers, as well as to investigate through the normal tool the topics, the relevant policy topics on research topics on that have been present in Europe. And you can do it using tables, but also using maps. And this allows you to have a very clear representation of what is in place in Europe as to knowledge producers, geography, and topics addressed. Next slide, please. Final slides is about users. You know that European research infrastructure has this very important element that are addressing users, the user community. And the user community of RISIS is not so big as in other European research infrastructure for our STM fields, but for a social science infrastructure, it is a very good community and quite broad, because it includes not only science scholars community, but also research from neighboring fields. We have had very interesting interaction with some scholars from marine fields. We also have interaction with the Scientific Association, National Statistical Office and European Statistical Units, and governments, where governments is something that has to be conceived not only with reference to the state, but also to intermediary bodies such as research funding agencies, think tanks, scientific association, and so on. All the things are for producing research and innovation, which can be used for evidence-based policymaking. And this is all what I want to say. In the last slide, you find all the contacts that you can use for keeping in touch. I should recommend you to follow the RISIS updates, because there are a lot of news and events that are planned from here until the end of the year and for the next year as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Emanuela. So, and now we go under the academic content. So I'm happy to give the word to Barbara Antonioli Mantegazzini. She's senior researcher at the Università della Svizzera Italiana. She had a PhD in economics and law from the University of Paris, Marne-la-Vallée. And she's working on economics, regulation, and management of public services, and we think an important public service is higher education. So I give you the floor for your presentation, and as said, as soon as you have questions, post a small message and I will keep track for the final discussion. Thank you. Barbara, the floor is to you.
Thank you, Benedetto. Thank you to the RISIS organization. Thank you all of you for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to share our research work in progress with you, to collect suggestion, impression, and that will be very useful in order to improve our work. I am very grateful to Professor Hugo Horta to be my discussant, and I'm sure that this suggestion will be absolutely interesting and be kept in care. So I will try to share my presentation. Okay. Doesn't everybody can see? I think it's so. Okay. So the title of our contribution, as anticipated, is Business Model and Value Creation in Higher Education, by me and Professor Benedetto Lepori. It is still a work in progress, and sorry. Okay. What is the goal of our paper? The goal of our paper is to contribute to the debate on competition in the higher education sector through the concept of the business model as applied to the higher education institution. More detailed, we outline 4 theoretical business models according to what? According to how the value the value from multiple sources may be created, delivered, captured by different institutional stakeholders. In order to better corroborate our models, the idea is to go into details, into more detailed analysis through the presentation of several exemplary cases. The core elements of our paper is that the higher education sector has deeply changed in the last decades, and one of the main consequences is a stronger pressure towards competition between the institution, and this competition may be strategically addressed and managed through the help to the adoption of business models. Oh, sorry. Okay. No. Okay. Our contribution and the originality of the paper is that the application of the business model concept to the higher education sector is still an emerging idea. So in our opinion, it could represent a very powerful tool for understanding all the changes at the organizational level for the higher education institution, as well as maybe more interesting to analyze how institutions differently react to different public policies. Moreover, while the business models in higher education has been documented as well through very specific and individual case studies, to the best of our knowledge, this paper, our paper, offers the first definition of what we can call more general theoretical business models. What is our starting point? We start from the idea that the higher education landscape has changed. In particular, has deeply changed due to 3 different phenomena that are the massification, the budget austerity, and the new management policies. In particular, massification has led to an impressive increase of enrolling across all countries, and has transformed the institution from elite to large-scale universities, increasing their number. These institutions have to respond to new demand. Moreover, this increase of the student population and of the number of institutions has not found correspondence in a rise in funding, principally because of the economic crisis and of more stringent austerity policies, and also because alternative sources, for example, private sources, private funding, has not developed as expected. Moreover, at the same time, there is a wide debate about the extension of new public management reforms experienced by the public sector also to the higher education one, in order to improve efficiency in production and supply. This has led the institution to an increasingly adoption of market-like behaviors, also if competition is not limited to a specific market context. As an overall result, the rivalry between our institution has risen, with a pressure, with increasing pressure to act strategically, to rethink the behavior, to grab funding in order to attract new resources. this competition between institutions may have different, maybe of different types, because institutions may compete in many different ways because they are very heterogeneous. So due to this heterogeneity, there may have different way to act strategically. And in our opinion, the business model may help in understanding the institutional positioning within this renewed landscape. First of all, what is a business model? Business model is a very interesting tool, has increased its popularity both by practitioners and scholars, as confirmed by the rising number of papers and articles that are dedicated to this topic. At the same time, the literature highlights some limits in the theoretical grounding of business model in economics and business studies. So, nevertheless, potential link between business model literature and theory could be identified in organizational studies as well as in management and economic studies. To our goal, we decided to refer to the strategy literature, and therefore we defined the business model as the description of the organization value proposition, value creation, and capture through better performances and through sustainable competitive advantages. So the focus, as you can see, is on the value proposition, the value creation, and the value capture. Moreover, within the strategic literature, we decided to refer to the stakeholder theory. This because the value creation may affect not only the customer and the organization, the firm, as in the neoclassical theory, but also additional actors that can be qualified as internal and external stakeholders. This because higher education institutions play a very important key role in society, not only because they are their educational purpose, but also because they are in charge responsible for scientific investigation and transfer of knowledge to the society, to a broader community. What are the business model components? As you can see, we have the value proposition. The value proposition basically describes what the organization offers to the market. It includes the bundle of products and services that are of certain value to the customer, or in our case, to a more general audience of stakeholders. The value proposition, a good value proposition is based on services and goods that are compelling to customers to achieve advantageous cost and risk structures and enable significant value capture by the organization. We can define the value proposition as, in a certain way, a promise of value creation. The value creation may be defined as the activity to create what we call the perceived value. The perceived use value is essentially a subjective value that is defined by consumers or by the audiences on the basis of their perception of the usefulness of the offer. And it corresponds to the amount that the customers or the audiences are prepared to pay for the product. It essentially corresponds to the microeconomic idea of willingness to pay. It deals, essentially, the value creation deals with how the value is created. So it deals with the exploitation of the key resources and processes, and it also deals with the audience, so for whom the value is created, so for the audiences, the customer segments, and the relationship between the institution and the stakeholders. Once the value is created, is captured, and the value capture is defined by the capture exchange value. The exchange value is realized when the product, the good or service, is sold, and it corresponded to the amount paid by the buyer to the producer for the perceived used value. The literature agrees about the idea that the value capture may be approximated by the organization revenue model, even if literature agrees that the business model does not exactly coincide with the revenue model. But there is a wide consensus about the idea to use the revenue model, revenue streams to represent what is the idea, the general idea of business model. Once we have defined the concept of business model in a more general way, we adapt the idea of business model to the higher education sector. So we go into details of the value proposition. In our idea, the higher education institution may have many value propositions which give life to very potential relevant number of corresponding business model. For example, we may have institution offer that ranges from a large research university with a very broad course that are offered to a very research environment to the students, on the opposite, to small institution with no research but only focus on education, for example, liberal arts and colleges, or value proposition may include university with a close interaction between faculty and students, or more recently, for example, if we refer to the COVID of the last month, also may include also online programs or executive education and so on. Value proposition is moreover strictly related to the audiences and to the customer segmentation, because each segment of the customer, of the stakeholders, has common needs, common behaviors, and other attributes that have to be considered in order to better satisfy their desire. For example, we may have that for students, the value proposition essentially deals with the idea to obtain higher salaries once they go to the to the job market, or better qualified jobs for in general learners. While on the other hand, for example, for public administration or for government, the value proposition may deal with the opportunity, the possibility to train, to have high qualified and highly trained functionary to be put into the government public administration level. The value creation in higher education is essentially derives from the exploitation of strategical resources that can be multiple. That we can have a list of very interesting resources. For example, campus location, academic and administrative staff, a series of infrastructures or facilities. Also, qualified students represent a strategical resource for the institution, as well as we will see, reputation. The idea is that the exploitation of this bundle of resources may give the opportunity to the institution to create value. Please note that the resources may be tangible but also intangible, as we will see, for example, in the case that we select, that is the case of reputation. Here, the exploitation of key resources are important because it gives the opportunity to define a differentiated positioning for the institution and to create sustained competitive advantages. At the same time, value creation may rely also on the interaction between the strategical resources with different audiences, because we have seen that it can affect both. In this case, for example, if we focus on a key resource such as an intangible asset, maybe the most important intangible asset such as reputation, we can see that it can be considered as a positional good, and in the case of the exploitation of reputation, value creation may derive from an higher perceived value of the education and the research that's supplied by the university to its main audience, represented by students, because it is a perceived higher value of their degrees. But it also affects, for example, the employers, because the value creation may correspond in this case to higher wages paid to the graduated from a reputed institution, but we may also have consequences for the industries and also for the society as a whole due the present to positive externalities and spillovers. Reputation and historical heritage of the university determines hierarchies between the institutions that are very resistant to changes, and considering this, we may say that the reputation may be strategically managed to maintain and secure these competitive advantages. So it could represent one of our theoretical business model, or better, we built up our first theoretical business model around the idea of the exploitation of these important key resources. For the other business models that we sketch out, that we outlined, we focus on the interaction between value proposition, value creation, and the audiences and the demand size. In fact, in several cases, the strategic logic in value creation may be driven by the demand side, because value creation is as driven by the demand side is very important, because it gives attention to what customer value is. So institution may capture more economic value and increase their profit. In some cases, the involvement of the audiences in the value creation is so important that the audiences can be considered as a key resources as well. In our case, we suggest that the state is a very important audience for the higher education institution offer, because it includes that the idea that education and knowledge can be considered as public goods due to the presence of private and social value in their supply. The state can be considered as the main client for our institution, and because is in this case is looking for some social benefits related to the dissemination, to opportunity to have higher educated population, and also to the dissemination of the basic research and of knowledge in society as a whole. So the result is a value creation related to the presence of private and social value. At the same time, sometimes the value proposition may be strongly driven by the state that is asked for a specific high qualified training and education people in several selected fields that are considered strategical for the growth of the society and of the economy. In this case, the value creation is related to the perceived higher value of this on-demand education. Is the case, for example, that the state is the only buyer and for example, is asking for training in the health, engineering field or public administration field, and in this case is willing to pay for these highly qualified civil servants. As at the opposite of the state as an audience, as important client, we may have a private learner as audience and so as customer. In this case, we have the demand for highly specified training or for executive or vocational education is driven by students and the industry needs. And the value proposition is focused on the delivery of factor job-specific skills usually provided by specialized school, for example, the law school or the business school. In this case, the value creation mainly deals with labor market advantages, with networking and privileged relationship with industry and businesses for our students. Value, we have analyzed the value proposition, the value creation. The last component of our theoretical business model is represented by the value capture. As anticipated, the value capture can be approximated by the level, the composition of the revenues for the higher education institution considered, so the so-called funding mix. And in this case, the revenue model reflects the corresponding business model, or we can see that we can infer, on the other, we can infer the business model observing the revenue mix. This revenue mix, funding mix may vary also in a very important way according to the multiple sources of value creation, to the corresponding delivery of this value created to the stakeholders. Usually revenues mainly come from the state through the so-called basic state installment, and in this case the state pays the higher institution due to the presence of private and social value. Is the logic of the public good. We may also have additional funding from third-party, public and private bodies, for example, agency funding or businesses or donors. But we may also have revenues from students asking clearly for private education, and in this case the logic is that students pay because there are private benefits. The idea is that the presence of high spillovers and positive externalities justify the state funding, while the prevalence of private benefits returns a revenue mix highly unbalanced in favor of student fees. This is the outline of our theoretical business model developed according to the key resources that we select, that is the reputation, and according to the combination between resources and the audiences. So as you can see, we have a reputation with what we call a reputation business model that supply the so-called branded education and research, and we have the public good model that supply education and basic research, intended in some cases, some as public goods. We have the public service model that is much more focused on the training of people for the state. And finally, we have the private good model that is focused on the training for private learners and also for businesses, for example, in cases of executive education. In presence of reputation model, business, public good model, public service model, we have public and private benefit and spillovers, and the revenue model is highly unbalanced in favor of basic state installment and third-party funding. If we have private good model, the idea is that we have private benefits and the revenue model returns a very important presence of student fees. The second part of the paper is dedicated to the definition, the very clear definition of value proposition, value creation, and value capture for each of the business model outlined. Here you can have simply a very clear table that summarize our results. At the beginning, we just defined the public, the business model basis and the business model basis in higher education. That is more or less what we have just pointed out. Maybe the most interesting classification, not classification, but summarization is the one related to the value creation and the value capture. As you can see, value creation. We can see that the first model is the public good, the second is the reputation, the third is the public service, and the latter is the private good. Sorry, because I noticed just now that there is not the label in the first row. We also split between education and research because there may be different ways of value creation and different results for both. For example, the first model, as you can see, is the public good one. The public good model is the one that is usually focused on the offering of more generalist courses, and the idea is that value creation is related to the opportunity to have a more educated people. So we have national economic growth and development. There may be competitive advantages at country level for the selected institution and for a corresponding country. So we can have competitive advantages in global markets. For the society as a whole that act as a stakeholder, there are value creation advantages related to the possibility that the institution act as a connector between different parts of the society, and the opportunity to have a better citizenry and national building role. For research, as you can see, we can have knowledge that can be freely accessible from everybody. There is, as a result, a better understanding of the law of nature and society, and it could also represent a source, the basis for other for example, other public or private goods. For example, to have a very strong basic research may give life to innovative products.
Barbara, you should 5 minutes to close.
Okay. I close with this one and the one dedicated to the exemplary cases. The second is reputation. Just a few words. Reputation, the value creation mainly deal with premium higher prices due to the nature of reputation. For research, we have a higher perceived value of the scientific production and competitive advantages in attracting better researchers and public and private research grants. For the public service model, there is better citizenry, better better highly qualified technocratic and civil servants, and we have also the opportunity to have research for business, industries, and governments, while for the private good is clearly there are value creation related to the capitalization of the skill sets given to the learners on the labor market, and also to the opportunity to make some research with contractual research in consultancy for businesses, industry, and government. The revenue model capture this value creation, and as you can see, there is the differences in the funding mix. As you can see, the first model, that is the public good, is much more focused on the state basic installment, while the latter, ideally, there are no public funding, but only essentially the student fees, while for the reputation and the reputation one, there are core funding and also third-party funding due to the more qualified research developed by this institution. And in the public service model, there is, considering that the state is the only buyer, we can see, of the supply, there is a very high block grant funded by the state. We select, to corroborate our analysis, we select several case studies in order to clearly outline what are the value proposition, value creation, and value capture in the real world. We can see, so the idea is to select for the public good institution the University of Naples, Federico II, and Università de Nantes. For the reputation-based, the ETH and the Oxford, and their public services, the Hochschule in Germany, of Kiel in Germany, and the Zug University of Teacher. And the private good-based institution includes the RIT Croatia, Dubrovnik, and the London Business School. This is just an idea of how we think to develop our exemplary case study through the help of the business model canvas. This is the case of Oxford and ETH Zurich. And next steps, more detailed analysis of the role of stakeholders in value creation and capture. We want to go on in this field to corroborate, to develop the exemplary case studies, and to add a paragraph specifically dedicated to the policy implication of the business model for the higher education institution, discussing on how the institution will react differently to different public policies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to give the word directly to Hugo for his comment. Please unmute your micro, otherwise we will not hear you. Hugo.
Okay, is it on mute?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you so much. Let me start by thanking Benedetto and also Barbara for inviting me to provide some comments on this very interesting paper. I have a few comments. I won't take too long and just I'm going to give you my perspective. And let me start by, I also received the paper, which I read. Most of it I couldn't finish. I couldn't get to the case studies, but I read most of it. And my first comment then would be the preference to use users rather than consumers. The term consumer actually raises a lot of airs among several higher education researchers, and it also establishes a condition where one is purchasing services, when sometimes the relationships are a bit more than purchases. Let me give you an example. When one thinks of triple helix settings, they are mostly research-based, but can also involve training. It's likely that the state, companies, and universities are actually making use of each other's resources. They have a specific goal to do so, and they exchange resources rather than purchasing resources and for that particular activity. it creates, I think, a better dynamic in having users. Stakeholders, I mean, I think Barbara in the presentation relied more on the word stakeholders. I think stakeholders is also a very good option to be used. But I would consider really using users rather than customers, because not all the relations, not all the transactions that we can see in higher education markets relate necessarily to the idea of consumers. So just for you to consider. I completely agree with the drivers changing the higher education landscape. I would probably add just in one, it's not only the massification, but also a process of post-massification. Because what we're having in several countries is, you know, this process of growing, of massive growing, but now we got in several countries, most particularly in the developed countries all around the world, a process of, okay, we got to a plateau in terms of the number of students, and guess what? We probably don't need so many universities. So this has influences on how competition works in many countries. And I can tell you just the case of Korea and Japan, where several universities are being closed, are being merged, because they reach completely a post-massification stage where, you know, these universities simply are unsustainable from a financial standpoint. Okay, so this will be probably something that you might want to add, because it fits very much into what you're saying. But I would argue that at least two other drivers should be included, and these drivers, in my opinion, could add value to your models, which are already very interesting. Number one, considering the dimension of internationalization, because it leads to a completely different type of user. Not only the international student, because that is immediately the user that comes to mind, and the international student as a different type of student that demands substantial changes in curricula, support, infrastructures. Therefore, it means a cost, more cost, but also can provide, can bring a lot of interesting revenue and benefits. But also considering institutions in terms of partnerships and collaborations. We have seen the role, and the increasing role actually, of international sponsoring, donations, and creation of branch campuses. This complexified the entire situation, and in some cases, basically, when these are created, when this internationalization process is being created, it's been driven to some extent by individual institutions, but sometimes by bilateral agreements, and often by public policies that have the intention of creating knowledge hubs. Now, this is quite important because strategically it demands universities to transform substantially. And I think partly your business models might cover some of this, but not entirely. So this is something that you could be considering. The other point that leads to a change that I was hoping to see here, because I think it really has or can have an impact on your modeling, and in a way it relates to my previous point, is the one of globalization and world university rankings, which are clearly associated to the primacy of research as a source of prestige in academia. And when we think about globalization and world university rankings, it comes from a need of comparability that has to do with strategic positioning. It has to do with competitiveness. And it's basically driving universities to start playing in the international and national fields at the same time. If we think about a crucial commodity that you've mentioned and mentioned very well, which is reputation, this is quite important, because if we make an analogy to football, it's like if the universities before were only playing in the national leagues, and you could be highly reputable in the national leagues, and you still have in many countries highly reputable universities. But the thing is, right now, for many universities, this is not enough. They have to play and play well in the national leagues. They need to try to win them or get a better qualification as they can, and they need to qualify for UEFA, for the Champions League, because that is where opportunities can come. often opportunities come to from the national sources and from the national setup, but many interesting opportunities can come from playing internationally. And what you have is, in terms of prestige, in terms of competitiveness, tremendous changes, because what you are seeing is, and I can tell you examples from China, universities that up to 10 years were very prestigious nationally, but are feeling that they're losing the race internationally to other universities that nationally are much less prestigious, but they start coming up in the radar internationally while they are failing to do so. So this is driving pressures. This is driving for considering an international strategy versus a national, or how to make complementarities in a way to create synergies so that a better, more adequate strategic positioning can be reached. So this is two drivers that I didn't see so much there, because it seems to be still very focused on national logics, and I think these glonical heuristics can also add value to the model that you are working on. The business modeling actually seems a very interesting tool, I have to say, to observe and characterize the strategic options of universities, and complements, in my opinion, very well the more institutional based kind of modelings that we have in higher education. And I do agree to a very large extent that capturing this based on revenue for starters makes sense. However, I think you already hinted at that in a way. Other variables need to be observed and considered so that we understand better and differentiate better between these different models that we might get to. Currently, the four models seem to overlap and be difficult to disentangle in some parts, which I don't think it's a problem necessarily. This would need to go to the fine grain of detail, and I don't think it probably will be tremendously beneficial. I think it would be much more beneficial to understand that there is some overlapping to some extent. Let me give you another analogy. Basically, it's a bit like personality, right? All of us have different traits in our personalities. We simply have one trait that assumes primacy over the other traits. It doesn't mean that we don't have the other traits. It's simply a trait that is more powerful, leads us to have this specific personality, but the other traits usually are there. What you can get to with this is actually come to a very rich model in terms of saying, okay, we have in these kind of universities a specific dominance of this business model. Although other models were also identified, although to a lesser extent. And this, I think, meets in a much more realistic way what is really happening in universities, because you have in universities constantly a lot of contradictions and a lot of complexities. I remember being in a university in the United States, and in the same university, the Department of Engineering was playing in a field with a specific strategy that was radically different from the Department of English. Radically different. And we're talking about the same university. You will find these in all kinds of universities. So if you assume that within a university you find many different business models, but one assumes primacy, then you will be able to characterize, okay, in this university, this business model prevails, but others are also present to some extent, while you might find other universities where one or two business models may exist, and two of the others that you might expect to see are simply not there. So this is just some ideas that I have for you to consider as a possibility to develop the modeling. My final comment, I think is my final comment if I'm not mistaken. I have it here. I'm not sure to what extent the public service model differentiates from the common good model. It seems very close to one another, to be honest. the way I understood it, and I might be wrong, and please tell me if I am, the common good, the public good kind of university seemed to be kind of a Napoleonic type of university, with mostly a national focus. But I was wondering if there is no space to include a local community-based university. I mean, we usually think of this as the universities of applied sciences, but actually a lot of universities focus on the region, on the local, and they are universities. They're not polytechnics, they're not Hochschulen and things like that. So, and also a lot of their revenue actually often comes from local governments, or if we're talking about federations, from the state. So then this is another dimension that you might want to consider, but I don't want to over-complexify this. But it might be interesting to separate the universities who, have this training function, but are not necessarily research-oriented, but still national, from those who are focused on our public good, but more research-oriented, and those that then have no interest on the national or don't have the scope to be national. They are also not research-oriented, but rather they are very much localized in their mission and in their strategies. Besides the case studies, if I may, I would like to propose that you do, if you're going to use revenue as a starting point of analysis, that you would do an evolutionary or longitudinal analysis of revenues and other indicators to perceive how universities evolve across time. And if you can relate this with environmental changes, you mentioned the austerity, for example. That would be interesting to see how these universities, through their budget, change their strategy, change their behaviors in a way to adapt more reactively or proactively to a specific situation or to a specific environment. And this also, I think, would be very interesting to see for different kind of countries, particularly between countries that are more competitive driven and where public policies clearly foster this competition, and other countries that are less inclined to foster competition between universities. In this sense, once again, I think a global heuristic could add dimensionality to the current business models used. Yeah, and this is my comment. I hope it can help.
Thank you so much. These comments shows that we are at the core of an important debate, and maybe we have an important analytical tool with business model, and perhaps the group for more than one paper on the topic. Now, I suggest we first collect a few other questions, and then we give Barbara the opportunity to answer. I think the first one is Martin Lozano. You had a question. Could you just spell the question?
Yes, of course. I am going to read it, if that is okay. Well, business models can be positive, and we know that, because they may lead to innovation, competition, and get funding more easily. However, business models can also fall into focus more into costs in the short run, cutting costs in the short run, affecting our longer term goals, or excess automatization, which I believe could be arguably problematic at education institutions. So I was wondering if this is a valid concern to consider, or if I am probably missing something about the presentation and the researcher's view.
Thank you. I would give the floor also to Valeria Ramirez. What a question.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. That was very interesting. So my question was, I was wondering how these models can integrate with the idea of corporate and social responsibility concerns. So I know there is this, well, the obvious value in that way that it doesn't work as a normal corporation. But just I felt that this sustainability and job purpose are getting an increase attention in business. So, and that is also a request from stakeholders. I was wondering if CSR could apply to high education institutions as an element for their business model. I was thinking in, for example, the materiality matrix, so in which there is the idea of measuring the maturity on the different aspects that interest to the stakeholders, and then value the progress from the audited part to the others, for example, or I don't know. So which would be the, if there's any thought about this CSR, I don't know if it's trend, but well, this idea. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other immediate question, I would give Barbara 10 minutes the time to, and then we can make a final round of comments if somebody wants to add something. Barbara, the floor is to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Hugo for very interesting comments, and thank you also for to Martin and Valeria for their questions. The first observation by Hugo was about the idea the suggestion to use the word user instead of consumers. I agree, it could be useful because it adds values. Also, according to the idea that we select stakeholders as the idea to adopt a wider perspective in the audiences of the institution. So the idea of utilize users may be useful. So I refer to the classical theory of firm definition, no classical, but in this case, I think that it could be very more precise and more useful. About the idea to include also the post-massification stage and the internalization of the competition between institutions as additional drivers of the change in the landscape. I think it's very, very interesting. I also have some ideas in this sense, but it was a bit difficult to me to include to find the right way to separate, to disentangle the different business model. Also because, as you mentioned, this add complexity to the scenario, so it's much more difficult to separate in a very clear way the business model. But I think that it could be considered, that it had to be considered, as well as the idea of the ranking and globalization. The ranking, I analyzed also the literature of the ranking, focusing on reputation, because I consider the ranking as a proxy, a measure of reputation. It is not exactly the same, but we can use in this way. But maybe it could be useful to go more into detail of this key that could be considered as a key resources. I appreciate the comparison between the National League and the Champions League, because it's true. We, together with Benedetto, we made observation about the idea that we have very international institutions such as Oxford, Cambridge, or ETH, Zurich, that compete at the international level, while there are much more focused national institutions that are strong. For example, I don't know, University of Bologna, University of Paris, that are much more stronger at national level. They compete effectively in the national level, but they are, maybe we can see, weaker, forgive me, at the international ones. So the idea is to consider this two-level playing field. We can say it could be very, very useful. Don't know if I can. The idea is try to understand if there could be a different business model that focus on the international player, we can say that, I don't know, or if there could be in this case an overlap with the other. As you mentioned, the overlap is a problem, but opportunities, because we made also some very raw analysis of the of the revenue composition of the higher education institution found in the database of RISIS at RISIS, to have a very raw clusterization of our institution, and there were few overlaps between the universities. So there is, and I was wondering about, like you, to reason in terms of what is the prevalent business model. And I realized that there was not wrote in the presentation and in the paper, but the idea is that we can have also hybrid types of business models. So maybe it's much more realistic, it's much more frequent, the hybrid type. So you mix, for example, the private good with the public good, or the public service with the public good, or for example, I see the non-overlap between reputation and private in some cases. So it is there is this case, and there is this this type of new business model. The idea is to understand if it is reasonable to reason in terms of prevalence of the business model, and maybe we catch the opportunity to exemplary cases to highlight that there is a prevalent business model combined with others that are more small or small importance. But thank you for the suggestion. And I very much appreciated the idea to, in a certain way, separate the public good model from the public service model, that are in a certain way much close, because in both cases the state is the only buyer, with the difference that in the second case, the public service model, the state directly ask for a specific training, while in the public good, the idea is that the university are responsible, in charge for the offer of their courses. So the main difference is this one, but maybe the ideas to play to focus the difference between the two models on the local community based instead of national based, it is useful also, because if I go again to my raw clusterization, I remember that in the public good ones, the public good cluster, we found all the national or regional very important universities, while in the public service one there were also of small dimension and much more focus on specific courses, arts, liberal, music, policy, police or military formation, education, and so on. So it could be very, very interesting in this way. So I think it was the last, Martin, the question of Martin, I have to read it again, sorry, but so if I rightly understood, your idea is that if we much more focus on the revenue, so the revenue and cost structure in the short run, there will be differences in the long run. I rightly understand your questions? Martin?
Yes. I mean, basically, my point was that business models are good for firms because they might lead to innovation, competition, and get funding more easily. But what about the dark side? Let's say, for example, the lowering the cost in the short run, or an excess of automatization, which I believe that might be problematic for higher education institutions. And my point is that if this is a valid concern, or probably I am misunderstanding something here.
You are right when you say that the business model is much more clear for the classic typical firm, because it gives the opportunity to shortly and briefly adjust its strategically acting, while for higher education institution it is much more difficult, because as we see, there is a very strong persistency in the business model. What we say is that there is a difficult in changing of the radical change of business model over time. And in this case, the analysis suggested by Hugo could be useful to analyze over time how revenues changes, to observe if there has been changes also in the business model. But I think that it is difficult because the business model is very persistent, so it's difficult that is changed dramatically or in a very short period of time, while I think, but I'm not sure, that it could marginally change, adjusting the strategical acting in adding more offers. So the idea of the hybrid business model, maybe one institution start in a very public good way, and then it adds also courses and offer typical of the private good one. So in this case, your observation is right, but I think it not affect exactly our idea of the
I have to stop you since your 10 minutes are finished.
Sorry. Okay.
I would like
just for Valeria, yes, the sustainability to me is a very important key resource. So it could be useful to
I would like to say a couple of things and then give the floor to Philippe. Yeah. There are lots of very useful things, and they point to broadening, to complexifying, to some complexity which are not in the paper. And I think the most important is this idea of hybrids, that real cases are hybrid between business model. But, and I think that's a lesson for me as a co-author of the paper, all this depends on tightening the definition of the ideal business models, because all the construction rests on clear ideal types, and then you can start adding complexities. And my lesson listening also to the presentation is this has to do with a very stringent use of the concept from the literature. The literature gives us conceptual tools, value proposition, value creation, value capture, and this must be the basis of defining ideal types, which are clearly distinguished, and then we can go into the complexity of reality. Otherwise, the paper will be difficult to manage. But I would like to give the floor to Philippe. Unmute your microphone, because
okay. No, I had two comments. One is I think business models are very useful both in the private and the public sphere. TIS does a very beautiful did a very beautiful piece showing that in most industries there are only a few types of business models that apply to in that industry, so that it is very important to be able to understand what are underlying the differences between business models. But he also says that what is very important is to understand how do actors can move from one business model to another business model over time, and that these pathways are very important to consider when you want to describe the different types. So I would suggest you to think about that type of circulation over time, historically speaking, to see what may drive changes or moves, or what some call upgrading or whatever. So that was my first comment, which I think is in the use of business model, that these dimensions should be inscribed. And the second comment is that, in a way, your business model rely very much on state intervention. And then, is it the same thing when the state intervention is unified, or when it is decomposed between different level of public intervention, like in Switzerland, when the local community pays for education while the government pays for research? Or what happens when the state intervention is indirect and thus goes through the students, so the students are supported, to go to university, but then they pay fees and they select the university they go to and they pay fees. So how do you analyze this? How to analyze in business model this indirect situation? Okay. It's a for me it's a second order issue, but it's really an important issue because it might drive to a very different view of the US, for example. Because
okay.
we say in the US that students pay, but students from middle class families, they all have their money paid through the tax advantages that the family has built since the birth of the child, and so that's one way. And NGOs in the US, you take it out of your taxes directly. So it's private, but it's taxes that you prefer to direct to something than other things. So it's a very, if you take into account this indirect flows, state flows, we might have different views of the models or of the types in a way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think this conforms to what I said. We need to be clear about the archetypes.
Yeah.
And we can start looking how they mix our organizations switch between business model, which is a very important topic in the literature. Now, I think we can close here. First, let's say it was a fantastic pleasure to have this piece of virtual academic world. We have been used to working lonely and writing, and these exchanges, I hope you felt important. I would like to thank Barbara because she did most of the work. I would like to thank Hugo for a distant presence to RISIS, and I hope this will get you also acquainted about this incredible enterprise about data we are trying to set up. And I would like to thank also all people intervening and the CNR team, so Serena and Alessia, for a perfect organization. We know it's new land, this kind of workshops, and we are mastering it. And I'm really thinking that this might become an important way for a virtual infrastructure. In a way, we are already a virtual infrastructure, and this virtual setting is the best one for us because we are not all at the same place. Now, this is not the end of the story, so we would like to see you again, and this would be a sign that we enjoyed the format and the presentation and the quality of the content. So we have already planned 3 author seminars, so it's basically every month at the beginning of the month at the same time as today, and hopefully this will go on for not forever but for a while at least. So the next one is 7th of October, and the presentation will be by Giovanni Cerulli from CNR in Rome about another important topic, so how universities react to funding policies, the effects at performance level. So I really looking forward to meet you virtually again in the next research seminar, and also feel free to give suggestions on the format, and also if you think your research can be connected to RISIS, we would welcome proposals of presentations, because this must live with people contributing, is not just us. So I think with this we can close. And thank you very much, and wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very nice.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.